He entered the hospital anticipating a standard business engagement until his eyes fell upon three small girls in matching pink dresses sobbing outside the intensive care unit, and one of them glanced up at him with eyes that mirrored his own. Grace Thompson had not intended to pause. The trip to the hospital was purely professional. He was scheduled to approve a funding agreement for a cutting-edge expansion. Every aspect of his existence was governed by precision. His agenda, his dialogue, his cognition. He carried himself with the effectiveness of a man who had long since substituted feeling with action. Wearing a perfectly cut navy suit, carrying his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, he exited the elevator on the 4th floor, prepared to enter directly into a private meeting with the hospital's directors. But that was prior to spotting them. Positioned just beyond a patient room in the corridor, 3 young girls were standing close together, their small hands clasped. They appeared to be no older than 5. All were fair-haired, dressed in modest pale pink frocks, their faces streaked with tears. One girl clutched a plush rabbit with such force it seemed it might disintegrate. Another dabbed her eyes with the back of her hand. The third gazed emptily at the ground, her lips quivering. It was an image for which one could not prepare, an element so foreign to his meticulously arranged world that he nearly continued on his way. But then one of them looked upward. Her eyes were what he registered first. Large, brown, and deeply familiar. There was an element in the contour of her cheek, the form of her mouth, the subtle upward tilt of her brows in sorrow. It struck him with the force of an unexpected memory. He froze, uncertain of the reason, only aware that he could not proceed. No nurses were present, nor any other adults. The girls were by themselves. A knot formed in his chest as he approached them cautiously, as if nearing a skittish creature prone to flight. He softly cleared his throat and knelt to their height. "Hello," he murmured, his voice gentle. "Are you 3 okay? Did you lose track of someone?" The tallest of the trio shook her head. "Our mommy is in the ICU. They told us we can't go see her yet." He waited a moment. "Are you expecting someone? Is anyone coming for you?" All 3 shook their heads in sync. "There isn't anyone else," the girl with the stuffed rabbit stated. Only mommy." Grace felt his breathing catch. He was unsure why he remained on his knees, why he was suddenly compelled to learn more. There was a magnetic quality to their gaze, something that tugged at portions of himself he had long suppressed. He felt a desire to console them, but, more profoundly, he had to grasp why he was unable to turn away. Then the smallest of the 3 advanced a step and cocked her head. "Do you work here?" she inquired. "No," he answered. "I'm just visiting." She observed him for a second before saying quietly, "You resemble someone Mommy used to talk about." Grace felt the world tilt beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. In that instant, a piece of his carefully constructed existence started to fracture. Not with a crash, but with a quiet sound. A single fissure across the surface of his certainty, and he had not yet made it to the conference room. Grace was immobile. He stayed crouched before the 3 girls, the world seeming to decelerate to a peculiar, dreamlike speed. Their statements reverberated in his thoughts, particularly the last. "You resemble someone Mommy used to talk about." It wasn't merely the similarity or the way they watched him with large, hesitant eyes. It was a profound sensation in his chest, an abrupt conviction that this was no accident. He was at a loss for what to do with this information, unsure how to bear the weight of this new understanding. So he did what he was able. He remained with them. He gently inquired about their names, and they responded in soft, slightly quivering voices, Maddie, Chloe, and Jane. Each name was like a small pebble dropped in water, sending ripples through recollections he hadn't accessed for years. He asked about their mother, and they informed him her name was Emma. That name was not unfamiliar. It landed like a blow to his gut. He recalled Emma vividly. The warmth in her speech. The way she would laugh at things others didn't find amusing. How she had once regarded him as if he were the only person on earth. They had shared something genuine, brief yet indelible. And then she had disappeared. 5 years had passed without contact. He had made a half-hearted attempt to find her early on, but his career had consumed him, and he had allowed her memory to fade further away until this moment. Until these three girls, who seemed to bear his features, were standing in a hospital corridor with nowhere else to be. Grace rose slowly and scanned the area. Still, no staff had come to see about the girls. An unfamiliar irritation grew within him. How could they be left unaided? He took out his phone and went to the nurse's station. Gaining the attention of the woman at the desk, he spoke in a steady, firm voice. "There are 3 children alone in the hallway by ICU room 402, he stated. "They've been waiting there for an unknown amount of time. Can someone please check on them?" The nurse blinked, then glanced down the corridor. "Oh, yes, that's Emma Rivers' room. The girls have been there most of the day. We've been understaffed, and since they're not technically patients..." He cut her off. "They're 5 years old and they're frightened. Someone needs to be responsible for them." She gave a slightly defensive nod. "I'll let the social worker know." But Grace had already turned away. He didn't need someone else to intervene. He couldn't articulate it, but he sensed a change within him, a sense of urgency coupled with responsibility. It was not pity. It was not remorse. It was something much deeper. When he got back to the girls, they were now seated on the floor, holding hands huddled together. He knelt once more, this time with more deliberation. "Your mom," he said softly. "She and I knew each other some time ago." Chloe, the middle one, tilted her head. "Are you a friend?" "I believe I was," he said quietly. "Mommy doesn't talk about friends anymore," Maddie chimed in. "Just work and stories at bedtime." Grace felt another crack form inside him. They chatted a bit more about their favorite cartoons, their preferred colors, and what they missed about their home. The crying had stopped, but they continued to cling to each other as if releasing their hold would destroy the delicate security they had created in that corridor. When the social worker eventually came, a kind-faced woman with weary eyes and a clipboard, Grace stood to greet her. She inquired who he was, and for a fleeting second, he was unsure what to say. "I'm someone who once meant something to their mother," he said. "And I suspect I might mean something to them, too." He waited while the girls were led to a small waiting area with toys and juice. He provided his number to the social worker and requested to be kept informed. He was uncertain of what was to come, but one thing was evident. He was not leaving. Not from Emma. Not from these girls. Not from the life that had just reemerged without notice and insisted on being confronted. The hours that came next were a blur for Grace, yet everything within him was intensely focused. He had not gone back to his meeting. The idea of discussing funding while Emma lay unconscious in the ICU and 3 small girls waited by themselves in another room seemed almost obscene. Instead, he dedicated that day and the following one to piecing together what had occurred to the woman he had once known and the life that had developed in his absence. He found out from the social worker that Emma had been brought in the night before after a sudden health emergency. The information was limited, but the gravity of the situation was undeniable. She was unconscious and stable, yet in critical condition. No other relatives were on her record. No emergency contacts, only the children, only Emma. It was this detail, no one else, that troubled him. Grace had spent the last 5 years thinking Emma had chosen a life without him, that their connection had been ephemeral or insufficient. But now he began to wonder if her silence had stemmed from something else. Fear, a need to protect, or sacrifice. He recalled how their relationship had concluded. It wasn't due to a fight or a betrayal. It was a slow separation driven by the widening divide between her simple world and his corporate ascent. She had said goodbye in a letter, one he barely had time to read then. He remembered her writing that she sought something authentic and stable and hoped he would one day find that too. He hadn't. Not until this moment. That afternoon, he was back in the hallway, this time outside Emma's room, the steady beeping of monitors faintly audible through the closed door. A nurse let him in for a few minutes. Emma appeared so frail in the hospital bed. Her blonde hair was damp at her temples, her complexion pale, her breathing slow and assisted. He entered cautiously, as if stepping into a sacred space. He sat by her side, unsure if she could hear. "I don't know what became of you," he whispered. "But I think I'm finally understanding what became of us." He paused, then took her hand, gently enclosing his fingers around hers. "There are 3 little girls down the hall who resemble you so much it's painful. But they resemble me too. I don't understand why you didn't tell me. I don't even know if you meant to, but I've met them. Maddie, Chloe, Jane. They're brave, scared, and clever. They waited for you all day without a word of complaint. I've never seen anything like it." His throat constricted. The words came more slowly. "Emma, I think they're mine as well." He didn't anticipate a reply, but he saw her fingers move slightly within his grasp. Perhaps it was a reflex, perhaps not. Regardless, it was enough to compel him to stay for another hour, simply sitting there, recounting everything she had missed. How chilly the hallway had been. How Chloe had attempted to describe her dream to him in great detail. How Maddie had stood before her sisters like a small soldier, and how Jane had quietly held on to the bunny the entire time without speaking. When visiting hours concluded, he went back to the waiting room, where the girls sat with coloring books and juice. He brought them dinner, sat on the floor with them, and listened to their stories about their mom. How she always kissed them in the same sequence. How she sang made-up tunes when the lights were out. How she would whisper always, always when they asked if she would ever leave them. They spoke about bedtime routines, their favorite toys, and the small apartment they shared. The more he listened, the more he perceived the voids his absence had created. The more he understood how much he had been missing. At one point, Maddie looked at him with wide eyes and asked, "Did you love our mommy?" He paused, taken aback by the directness. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, I did, very much." "Do you still?" she inquired. He considered it. He thought about what love signified now, after all that had happened. "Yes," he said at last. "Maybe more than I ever did." That night, after the girls had drifted to sleep on a couch in the family waiting area, Grace sat alone in the corner. He stared at the wall for a long time, then took out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel everything for the next 2 weeks, he instructed. There was a pause. "Sir, you have—" "I know," he interrupted. "Cancel it all." He ended the call and looked back at the girls, huddled together like the petals of a single flower. He had made his decision, and this time he was not going to miss what was important. The following morning, Grace was at the hospital before dawn. The corridors were dim and still, filled only with the quiet rustle of nurses at shift change and the faint drone of machinery sustaining patients. He moved with intention, but not haste, stopping first at the waiting area where the girls had spent the night. They were still there, intertwined beneath a hospital blanket, their cheeks pink with sleep, their small arms resting on one another, as if they couldn't be at peace unless they were connected. Grace stood in the doorway watching them, a deep ache of protectiveness tightening in his chest, a feeling he had never before experienced. He had based his entire life's decisions on logic and returns. But this was different. This was something his heart comprehended before his mind could even find the words for it. He left a message with a nurse saying he would be back shortly, then proceeded to the ICU. Emma's state had not changed during the night. She was still unconscious, her body weak but persevering. Grace sat beside her again, this time with greater resolve in his actions. He didn't just speak about the girls. He told her about himself, about the life he'd constructed, the hollowness that accompanied his success, and how all of it began to feel insignificant the moment he saw 3 pairs of eyes looking up at him in that hallway. "I used to believe I had plenty of time," he said softly. "Time to pursue ambitions, time to return to things I'd left behind. But the reality is, I let you go too readily, and now I see I may have let go of the only part of my life that held true meaning." He remained until the nurses informed him it was time for their rounds, then went back to the girls. They were awake by then, rubbing sleep from their eyes and taking juice boxes from a weary but kind volunteer. When they saw Grace enter, their faces brightened, not with surprise, but with the reassurance of seeing someone they now anticipated. It unnerved him how swiftly he had become a constant for them. He sat on the floor with them once more, listening as they took turns identifying their stuffed animals and listing the cartoons they disliked. Jane, the quietest of the 3, leaned against him without a word, just resting her head on his arm as she colored. He didn't stir. He wouldn't have dared. That afternoon, he met with the hospital social worker again, this time posing questions not about visitation or rules, but about guardianship. He was unfamiliar with the system, but he wanted to learn. He wanted to handle this correctly. He wanted to ensure that, regardless of what happened to Emma, the girls wouldn't be placed with strangers, wouldn't be lost in a maze of paperwork and state institutions. He provided his name, clarified his relationship, and then, not wanting to waste another moment, requested a DNA test. The social worker, a sharp yet compassionate woman named Marissa, listened intently. She offered no guarantees, but she recognized the expression in his eyes and the way the girls held on to him. She consented to expedite the process as much as the law would allow. That night, Grace brought the girls to his condo. It was sleek, modern, and cold, with its perfect angles and polished surfaces. It had never been a home for children. But the instant they stepped inside, holding his hands and carrying their small bags and cherished toys, the atmosphere changed. Their laughter echoed off the walls. Their little socks skidded on the smooth floors, and Grace found himself laughing more in that single evening than he had in months. He had pizza delivered. He let them sit on the sofa with greasy fingers. He read bedtime stories using 3 distinct voices because they insisted each character needed its own. When they finally fell asleep in the guest room together in one bed, unwilling to be parted, he stood in the doorway watching them for a long time, struck by how natural it had all started to feel. He thought of Emma again, lying in that hospital bed, unaware that the man she once loved had come back and was trying to reassemble the pieces. He didn't know if she would ever regain consciousness, but he knew with absolute certainty that if she did, she would not find them alone. He would be there, and he had no intention of leaving. By the end of the week, Grace had settled into a new routine, one that was strange and often chaotic, but surprisingly stabilizing. Mornings began with detangling 3 very different heads of blonde hair, pouring lopsided bowls of cereal, and learning the specific preferences each girl had for her apple slices at lunch. The organized structure of his former life, early conference calls, board meetings, flights scheduled down to the minute, had been replaced by crayons on the kitchen counter and a forgotten laptop collecting dust. He hadn't foreseen any of this, yet he could not fathom leaving it behind. He transported the girls to school in a car that previously held only briefcases and silence. It now resounded with questions, debates over cartoon characters, and one girl, typically Maddie, demanding control of the music. After dropping them off, Grace would invariably head back to the hospital each morning, visiting Emma's room before attending to any other part of his day. Her condition was static, but the nurses had grown accustomed to him, even placing a second chair by her bed. He talked to her daily about the girls, what they were doing, what they said, how Jane had started to whisper more, how Chloe had informed him that he didn't fold clothes correctly, but that it was fine because you're trying. He told Emma that he missed her in a way that was not about romance, but about the void that had formed inside him over the past 5 years. He confessed his fear of raising children he hadn't known existed, and how, in spite of that, he had never felt more sure about anything. Her hand remained still, her eyes closed, but he stayed regardless. One afternoon, after collecting the girls from school and assisting them with their art projects at the dining table, he sat with Marissa, the social worker, to go over the DNA test results. The evidence was on a single white sheet, stark and conclusive. He was their biological father. She passed it to him with a look suggesting she anticipated a bigger reaction, but Grace just nodded. The test had only confirmed what his heart had already embraced. He had seen it in the way Chloe rolled her eyes, in how Maddie folded her arms when annoyed, in how Jane stared without blinking when she was confused. They were parts of him, wild, gentle, stubborn, and brave. Marissa then guided him through the steps of becoming their legal guardian, at least for the time being. It would involve evaluations, court appearances, and paperwork. It would be a process, and until Emma recovered, nothing could be finalized. But Grace was unfazed by the path ahead. He simply asked what was required and started to act. He even began looking into preschools nearer to his apartment, ones with music classes and outdoor areas that didn't seem like confinement. He asked the girls what they liked and disliked about their current school, involving them in decisions about their new lives. That weekend, he took them to buy new clothes, not out of necessity, but because he wanted them to have something that wasn't a hand-me-down or worn through at the knees. They chose dresses with glitter and shoes that lit up and insisted he buy a bright red tie to match. He wore it without protest. Later that evening, they all made dinner together, which largely consisted of him cleaning up flour messes and attempting not to overcook the pasta. When the girls were finally in bed, full of stories and sugar, Grace sat on the edge of his couch, surveying the empty space around him and realizing it no longer felt vacant. It was now filled with small drawings on the fridge, mismatched socks under the table, and the lingering sound of laughter from down the hall. His phone vibrated with a text from his assistant asking about his availability for a rescheduled board call. He looked at the screen for a long moment before replying with a simple, "Not yet." He set the phone down and walked to the guest room, peeking in to see all three girls curled up together, deeply asleep. He watched them, overcome by a feeling that had no name, only substance. He didn't know what the future held, how long Emma would be in that hospital bed, or what difficulties were to come. But he knew with absolute clarity that his life had been rewritten, and he had no wish to return to his former existence. On the 12th day of Emma's stay in the hospital, there was a shift. It was minor at first. Her fingers moved, her eyelids twitched, and the monitors registered a small change in her vital signs. Grace had just come in, as he did every morning, with coffee for the nurses and a quiet patience for his vigil by her bed. He had become familiar with the room's rhythm, the antiseptic scent, the low hum of the equipment. But today, when her hand stirred beneath his, he almost dropped his cup. The nurse hurried in, checked the monitors, and whispered that it might be a sign she was waking. Grace held his breath for the next 10 minutes. He leaned closer, said her name, saw her eyelids flutter again, and this time slowly open. Her gaze was hazy, disoriented, her lips dry and slightly open. She blinked against the bright light above, then gradually turned her eyes to him. Initially, there was no sign of recognition. Then, as if her memory was catching up with her consciousness, her brow crinkled. Her voice was raspy and barely a whisper, but it was clear. "Grace!" He nodded, overcome with emotion. "I'm here. I've been here." Her eyes immediately filled with tears, confusion mixed with her emotion. "The girls, are they?" "They're safe. They're with me," he said softly. "They've been so brave, Emma. They've been waiting for you. Every single day." She began to cry then, weakly, silently, but completely. Grace held her hand, allowing her to absorb the new reality. The nurse gave them a moment before discreetly exiting and closing the door. He stayed with Emma as she grew calmer, as the haze of medication and fear gradually cleared from her expression. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice still hoarse and low. "I wanted to, so many times, but you were so far away. You were living a different life." "You should have told me," Grace said, but without accusation. His tone was full of regret, not blame. "I would have come. I would have been there." "I was scared," she confessed, "scared you would feel trapped, or worse, that you would feel nothing." Grace leaned back, taking a deep breath, letting the full weight of everything settle between them. "I didn't know, but the instant I saw them, I did." Emma shut her eyes for a moment, as if the conversation had drained her. When she opened them again, she looked directly at him, vulnerable and sincere. "Are you really here?" he answered without pause. "Yes, and I'm not going anywhere." He described the days she had missed, the hallway, how Maddie had been a stoic little soldier, how Jane barely spoke but clung to her stuffed rabbit, and how Chloe had asked difficult questions and expected answers. He told her about the pancakes he'd burned, the songs they sang in the car, and the chaotic bedtime routines that always ended with all three of them in one bed. He saw her smile, weary but genuine, and for an instant he felt the world right itself. When the doctor arrived, they spoke in hushed tones. Emma's recovery would be gradual. Her body was weak and she would require rehabilitation. But the outlook was positive. She was going to get better. That evening, Grace brought the girls to the hospital, not into the room, but just outside. They stood by the glass, and when Emma saw them, her hands shook with emotion. The girls waved excitedly, pressing their hands against the glass, and Emma mirrored the gesture from her side. She mouthed the words, "I love you." All three girls mouthed them back. Maddie held up a picture they had drawn that morning. 5 stick figures holding hands under a house with a sun in the corner. It said "Home" in large, wobbly letters. Emma cried again, and so did Grace. When they left the hospital that night, the girls were quiet in the car, holding his hands from the back. He met their eyes in the rearview mirror and said, "Your mommy is going to be okay." Chloe asked, "And us?" He smiled gently. "You're going to be better than okay." Because they were no longer waiting. They were starting a new chapter, and for the first time, it felt like they were all characters in the same story. The days following Emma's awakening were marked by slow progress, quiet wonders, and the small triumphs that held significance only for those who had endured uncertainty. Grace juggled hospital visits with school runs, bedtime stories, and learning to braid 3 sets of blonde hair, imperfectly, but with a dedication the girls consistently praised. He once defined multitasking as managing high-stakes negotiations in corporate emergencies. Now he knew true multitasking was cradling a sick child while flipping pancakes for 2 others who would only eat them if they were star-shaped. Emma's recovery was steady. Her speech grew clearer, she could sit up for brief periods, and she even asked to read the notes the girls wrote for her. Grace brought them for short visits, and each time they came into the room, Emma's vitality seemed to surge. The girls were never boisterous around her. They were instinctively gentle, each showing affection in her own manner. Maddie would sit close and inquire about the medical equipment. Chloe always had stories to share. Jane would simply hold her mother's hand, silently studying her face with her large, pensive eyes. One afternoon, while Emma rested and the girls were occupied with coloring books in the hospital lounge, Grace stood by the window with Marissa. Sunlight streamed through the glass in golden shafts, and the world outside carried on as before, oblivious to the small changes that had completely reoriented his life. Marissa held paperwork, documents that would permit Grace to proceed with permanent custody, pending Emma's consent. The forms felt substantial in his hands, not with burden, but with the weight of the realization that he was making this choice, not out of duty or obligation, but because somewhere in the turmoil of the past few weeks, he had become a father. Later that evening, Grace was beside Emma in her hospital room. The lights were dim, and the girls were at home with a trusted babysitter. Emma's hair was now tied back, and while her face still showed signs of fatigue, her complexion had more color, her gaze more clarity. She looked at him as if seeing a familiar place with fresh eyes. "They love you," she said quietly. "I love them," he responded with equal softness. "And you?" Emma held his gaze. "You've changed. You're more gentle, but also stronger." "I didn't know what I was missing," he said, "until I found it all standing outside a hospital room in pink dresses, crying. I wanted to protect them," she confessed, "from everything, including you." "I understand why," Grace said, "but I'm here now, and I want to do this with you, not just for you." They spoke for a long time, not about the past or assigning blame, but about practicalities, hope, and the unclear road ahead. Grace told her about the girls' new favorite bedtime song, how Jane had finally started talking more while coloring, and how Chloe insisted they all eat the same cereal because that's what families do. He watched Emma absorb it all and saw her soften even more. When she inquired about the custody documents, he didn't press the issue. He said he would wait, that her recovery was more important, and that whatever they decided, they would do it together. She reached for his hand. "I think we're already a family," she whispered. "We just need to learn how to be one." That night, as Grace tucked the girls in, he knew she was right. It wasn't about titles or defined roles. It was about being present, being consistent, about the thousands of small decisions made daily to love, to be there, and to try. The girls fell asleep quickly, their bodies in familiar poses, their trust in him no longer hesitant, but complete. Grace stood in the doorway and looked at them. 3 lives once hidden from him were now the center of his universe. And in that quiet moment, he knew the hardest part was no longer the uncertainty. It was holding on to everything he had found and never letting it go. A month later, the hospital room where Emma had once lain, pale and still, was vacant. She had been released just 3 days prior, walking out with slow but sure steps, her daughters holding on to each of her arms like the most reliable support imaginable. Grace had brought them home in his car, which had transformed into a secondary family room, with crayons in the glove compartment and granola bar wrappers beneath the seats. They went not to her former apartment, which had been cleared out during her hospitalization, but to Grace's residence, now completely altered. What was once sterile and modern had become a space filled with warmth. Toy bins lined the hallway, tiny socks were wedged in the sofa cushions, drawings adorned the kitchen cabinets, and the table was set for 5 each night, regardless of appetite. On Emma's first night home, they all gathered around the dinner table for spaghetti that Chloe had insisted be colored pink. The girls chattered over each other, laughing and giving disorganized updates from school. Emma listened, initially emotional, until she too started to laugh. Her laughter was softer than before, touched with weariness, but it was genuine. Grace observed her from across the table, not with pity or remorse, but with respect. She had overcome something that would have defeated many. Yet there she was, passing the salt, ensuring Maddie wiped sauce from her face, and reminding Jane not to use her fingers. It was a form of strength that commanded a new level of reverence from him. As the days went on, their routine solidified. Grace permanently altered his work commitments, delegating leadership on several projects, and even resigning as CEO, retaining only the chairman's title to be home for bedtime stories and school pickups. The business community viewed it as a bewildering move. Headlines declared he was stepping down at his peak. But Grace was indifferent. He hadn't stepped down. He had finally stepped up to something meaningful. Each morning began with a shared, often messy breakfast of spilled milk and mismatched footwear. Each evening concluded with the girls in pajamas, listening to one of Emma's stories or Grace's improvised space sagas with characters named after their toys. On a Saturday in early spring, they hosted a small backyard party for the girls' 6th birthday. School friends attended, neighbors brought treats, and a magician had even been hired. But the highlight of the day wasn't the illusions or decorations. It was when Emma stood, microphone in hand, her voice unsteady, and thanked everyone for being part of what she described as the most unforeseen, most wonderful second chance life could provide. Then she looked straight at Grace, her eyes gentle and unwavering, and said, "And thank you for finding us when we didn't even realize we were waiting to be found." Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the girls were asleep amidst wrapping paper and sparkly tiaras, Emma and Grace sat on the porch under a strand of lights. The night was warm, settling on the skin like a memory. They were quiet for a time, just listening to the crickets and the soft sound of wind in the trees. Finally, Emma turned to him. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we had kept in touch? If I had told you back then?" He shook his head, not with regret, but with conviction. "We might have had a version of this earlier, but maybe it wouldn't have been this version. And I like this one. It's disorganized and difficult and utterly beyond my control, but it's ours." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're not the man I left." He smiled and took her hand. "And you're not the woman who walked away." They remained like that in silence for a long while, looking at the house that now contained the 4 people who had become his entire world. The laughter, the difficulties, the noise, the quiet, it was all real, and it belonged to them. Inside, on the fridge among the drawings and notes, was a piece of paper the girls had written on earlier that week in colored marker. It declared in uneven, happy letters, "Home is everyone being together always." And in that moment, Grace knew they weren't just a family. They were a miracle, reconstructed from pieces he never knew he was missing, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to making sure it never came apart again. From a writer's viewpoint, this story's conclusion feels not just emotionally fulfilling, but profoundly deserved. It doesn't depend on shocking developments or an idealized love story to solve the character's problems. Instead, it draws on something much more potent: quiet atonement, chosen accountability, and the slow reconstruction of trust. Grace does not become a hero instantly. He becomes a father by being present day after day in the small, frequently messy moments that truly count. Emma's recovery, both physically and emotionally, is credible because it is gradual, not accelerated or romanticized. And the girls, each with her own distinct personality and resilience, are never used as mere devices for Grace's character arc, but as complete essential characters who form the emotional heart of the narrative. The final scene of them all together, celebrating, laughing, living a simple but significant life, does not seem like a fairy tale. It seems like a life that was earned and chosen, and that is what makes the ending so beautiful. It's not about everything being flawless, it's about it finally being authentic.